maps are wrong, a lot. In fact, 40% of the time, they're 100% wrong, and it costs me thousands of dollars. And in today's video, I'm going to show you exactly what to do to make sure your flood map is not wrong. So let's get started. But before we do, share, subscribe, and like the channel below. And I'm here with my content manager, Jacob, today, and we're talking about exactly what to do to make sure that your flood zone is correct. And what in the world is a SFHA, Jacob?
Tell me.
So today we're talking about special flood hazard areas. What do you need to know about them? Are they going to impact your mortgage like they did me? Are they going to delay your closing like they did me? Or are they going to have any impact at all? So when we're talking about special flood hazard areas, we're talking about areas like flood zone A and flood zone AE. Think about it, these are areas where if you have a mortgage, flood insurance is going to be required. But if you see something like X, go holla, because that means great news for you. Like it did me when I changed my flood zone, in fact, impacting my property value by almost $100,000. So what does AE and X all mean? Look, it all means is probability. All it means is that 1 in 100 chances every given year, your property could flood. But look, we hear from people every day, Jacob, and they say, look, my house has never flooded in 50 years. I don't have to worry about it.
So Chris, we have 20 questions here we need to go through, covering everything from A to Z with SFHAs. So our first question here says, what kind of evidence does FEMA actually accept when you're trying to prove their flood maps are wrong?
Look, we've been proving flood maps wrong for more than a decade. As I said, I changed my own flood zone, and I've had more than 1,000 people do the same thing. And what FEMA's looking at really is that you are above the elevation, the base flood elevation, what FEMA thinks flooding could come to. Now imagine this. You have an imaginary line, and they think the water's going to stop that line. Crazy, isn't it?
It's insane.
It's absolutely insane to think that water can stop that imaginary line. Remember, what we always say here, flood zones are like in-laws. They have no boundaries. And they show up at the worst unexpected time. And looking at all these different areas, Jacob, we're talking about these special flood hazard areas and these 20 questions you were talking about, you know, what FEMA actually means in documentation. Look, they want an elevation certificate to show that you're above that level. They want to see that you own the property. So they're looking for a property deed usually, a subdivision plat, tax map. You know, there's a different series of about 5 different documents they need. And when they review it, it usually takes them a minimum of 30 days to review this. It can take longer, but at a minimum, expect 30 to 60 days before they review this. And then they'll give you a decision, and a couple of these decisions end like this. Either we need more information, or you're gonna get a yes or a no. Now look, you may get changed, you may not, but it doesn't stop here. If you have a mortgage and you do get removed, you still need to send this letter to your mortgage company, letting them know it's no longer required. Then if you do have flood insurance, you do want to cancel it, look, remember, changing this flood zone doesn't change your risk. It just simply changes the bank's requirement. Almost 40% of flood claims across the country happen in flood zone X, but you still have to send this letter to the bank, and then the bank will release the requirement for flood insurance in most situations. Now remember though, even if you've had it changed, the bank can technically still require it here. So don't be completely shocked if you're still dealing with that requirement. In fact, you may only want to go find a new bank if they do continue the requirement. We have seen that before. So let's talk about the next question, Jacob.
Okay, Chris. So our next one here says, if I want to challenge FEMA's flood elevation for my area, what kind of engineering study am I going to need for that?
Typically, you need what's called a flood insurance study report. So if there's no base flood elevation, remember, most of flood zone A is not going to have one because it hasn't been done yet. Then you will have a surveyor, really an engineer, to come in and do a survey report or a flood insurance study report. Get with your local floodplain manager to see if one's already been done. If it hasn't, it could end up costing you thousands of dollars. In fact, flood insurance might actually be cheaper sometimes than even the report.
Wow. Okay. So moving on here, I have multiple commercial buildings and only one is in a flood zone. How do I figure out the insurance requirements?
Remember, we talked about earlier in this video, if it says flood zone A or AE and you've got a mortgage on that commercial property, it's going to be required. However, we're seeing more and more now where these banks, the closer they are to a floodway, the closer they are to a certain flood zone, they're still requiring it. Because guess what? The banks are finally getting smart, realizing floods don't stop at that imaginary line.
Okay. So our next question here says, my property is near a floodway. What do I need to prove that my development won't make flooding worse?
So usually what you have to show is that you're not building in this floodway. Look, if all these buildings are already built in floodway, there's nothing you can do about it. But what you do need to know is that floodways can have a huge impact on flood insurance rates, especially the National Flood Insurance Program, who historically did not use this as an actual rating factor, but in Risk Rating 2.0 now, after helping thousands of customers here at the Flood Insurance Guru, we're seeing this as a big rate indicator. Also, remember, a lot of private companies will not insure a property in a floodway. So whenever you're looking at buying that property, ask, is the property in a floodway? Or you can just click the link in the bottom of this video and go to our flood risk score, where we always show you where the floodway is and how close you are.
Okay, so moving on here, our next question that came in says, for my commercial building, should I use replacement cost or actual cash value for flood insurance calculations?
Well, let me ask this question. Do you want zero money or do you want a lot of money? Because that's really what you should be asking here. Because if you don't use replacement costs, you're going to be very disappointed come claims time. Replacement cost is used also as a rating indicator, so you have to use that. Especially with FEMA, you have to sometimes provide a report that shows your replacement cost estimated. But remember, get a couple of these. Get an appraisal if you have it, because this can have a big impact on your premium if it's wrong.
Okay, so now we have someone asking, how do I know if a private flood insurance policy will actually meet my lender's requirements?
Well, Jacob, you know, we've talked about this in some of our other videos, and that is the private flood insurance clause. Make sure it's in your policy jacket. Remember, the policy jacket is going to be the set of documents that has all the definitions of what's considered a flood, loss assessment, and all these things. Ask for a policy jacket before you take that policy out, because there may be a minimum earned premium where you can't change your mind later, and now you're out 25 to 50%, especially on the commercial property. And if you're dealing with a private hard money lender that we talked about in some other videos, they may need a copy of this even before they accept the policy.
Okay, now we have someone asking, can my bank really force me to buy flood insurance just because FEMA changed the maps?
Absolutely. Remember, some of these maps take 5, 10 years, 15 years. Look at Hurricane Harvey there, Houston. These maps were going back and forth for 15 to 20 years. In fact, 85% of the people who lost everything during Harvey because they didn't have flood insurance would have been required to carry it 6 months later when these new maps went in place. So just remember how out of date these maps are. And remember, on average, it takes 5 years for a process between the flood insurance study report, agreeing with the community. So it can take time. Imagine how much land can change in 5 years. I mean, Jacob, look at you. Well, you looked at 5 years ago. I mean, you were a lot heavier. But come on, you were going to work, you know? Like, things changed a lot in 5 years. I had hair. So, I mean, things changed a lot.
So did I. Our next question here says, what's the difference between a LOMA and LOMRF, and which one do I need?
Letter of map amendments or letter of map amendment revisions. Remember, revisions usually have to do with more than one property, typically. Now, there's rare situations where it may not be the case, but in most situations, think about a neighborhood being removed. That might be a map revision, but a letter of map amendment might just be one structure or one parcel.
Okay, so the next one says, my building is exactly 50% commercial use. How does that affect my flood insurance classification?
Well, it has a big impact because with the National Flood Insurance Program, they typically have a 75-25 rule. If just over 25% is being used for commercial, it's a commercial property. So think about these mixed uses where you may have retail space on the bottom, apartments up top. You know, these mixed uses can get kind of tricky here. Now, on the private side, they typically use the National Flood Insurance Program definitions as well. So you want to make sure that you disclose what it's being used for, how it's being used, because if this policy is written the wrong way, you may not get the coverage that either the bank's going to require or the coverage that you need to replace the property.
Okay, so moving on here, we have someone asking, the street in front of my lot is in a flood zone. Does that mean I can't build at all?
No, you cannot build in flood zones. You can build in flood zones. It doesn't really matter. What really you need to pay attention to here is floodplain management guidelines and floodways. Avoiding that floodway. You can absolutely build in these flood zones. In fact, if you're in flood zone A or AE and you're building a commercial building, they're going to look to make sure you're building above the base flood elevation. But it doesn't stop at that on increasing your profit per door as a real estate investor. Take it one step further. And if you're building, build at least a foot or 2 feet above this base flood elevation. It's going to do a few things. It's going to lower the overall risk of a property flooding, and it's going to allow you to do a letter of map amendment or flood zone change after the structure is complete, helping you increase your property value long term.
Okay, so next question says, FEMA changed my property from AE to AH zone. What do I need to appeal this?
You don't. It's still an A. It's still going to be required.
So can you to kind of follow up with that, can you break down why there are so many different versions of flood zones?
So for example, things like we'll talk about AO, for example, or shaded X. Typically, these things to do with dams or levees that are nearby that are holding back water, especially shaded X versus X. Shaded X may have a much higher risk because of that. AO, let's just look at Arizona, for example. You'll have a lot of areas that are protected by levees, canals, and things like that. Savannah, Georgia, you may have some AO there because of how these canals are protecting certain areas.
Okay, so now we have someone asking, my lender's threatening to force place flood insurance. What are the rules they have to follow?
They have to follow the flood maps. So remember, mortgages are generally federally backed. That means they have to follow federal laws. And that means that if they don't follow this, they could be out millions of dollars because of fines. So if you've just been placed in that flood zone A or AE, you're getting a letter in the mail about 45 days before it's going to be required. So don't get mad at the bank. It's not the bank's fault. It's because they're federally backed or having to follow these out-of-date rules by the federal government.
Okay, so now our next question is, how do I prove my hotel guests stay longer than 6 months to get residential flood insurance rates?
I think what you're looking for is additional living expense. How do you get more than 6 months covered? All right, so you need to provide those receipts. Now remember though, just by 6 months, 12 months, it doesn't really matter. What matters is what's written on your policy. It could be up to 12 months. It could be up to a certain dollar amount. Look at that policy jacket. Look at policy exclusions. In fact, we're in an AI world now. Go over to ChatGPT upload the policy jacket. Just make sure your personal information is not on there and ask it for policy exclusions. In fact, I will include a description to the video where I actually show you how to do this about a year and a half ago, helping you better educate yourself when it comes to insurance policies before it's too late.
Okay, so we're getting close to the end here. The next one here says, FEMA's maps are too small scale and show my property wrong. How precise does my survey need to be?
Survey's got to be right on spot. That's the whole purpose of the elevation certificate, is it's being shot down to the inch. I mean, if this thing's just off by a couple inches with the lowest adjacent grade, in fact, we saw this happen in New Mexico, it was a difference in $2,000 a year in flood insurance and whether flood insurance was going to be required or not.
Wow, okay. Kind of a similar one, but a little bit different as well. Only part of my lot is in the flood zone. What are the rules for building on the safe part?
And building a safe part is going to depend, once again, where that base flood elevation is. You got to build above that if this is a pre-firm or post-firm structure. Remember, we're talking about post-firm here. We're talking about properties that are built after the first flood insurance rate map for that area. So if you had a property that was built in the 30s to 40s, that's going to be before the first flood map, which is in the 80s typically. So that's a pre-firm versus post-firm structure. So remember, those could have different guidelines. Those could have different rules on claims. And if you go to improve one of these, like adding a garage or improving more than 50%, remember that changes the year built according to the federal government when it comes to flood insurance. This means you may have to raise a property. It means you have to spend thousands of dollars filling in a basement. We saw that happen with a property owner in Ohio when they had this happen with a substantially improved property. So be very careful about how you add additions and how you file claims or do substantial improvements.
Okay, so now we have someone asking, my house is below the flood elevation. Is it cheaper to fix that or just pay for the insurance?
It really depends. Remember, it used to be historically this had a major impact, and it still has a big impact, but things like replacement costs, distance to water, the type of flooding, all these things that kind of go in that risk pool that make up your rate. Unfortunately, the National Flood Insurance Program is not transparent with us telling us actually what makes up a rate, but what we've seen after helping thousands of customers for more than a decade is that replacement costs, that lowest elevated floor, are still having big impacts on rate.
Okay, so now our question says, FEMA's flood zone barely touches my property, but my neighbors are fine. What proof do I need to fight this?
Once again, you're going to have that elevation certificate that shows that you should be in there. You're going to have that letter from FEMA stating that, hey, I've had a letter of map amendment done. And remember, the good news is on FEMA's site, once these are done, they are always under amendments or revisions on their website. So if you're a real estate agent or if you're a lender, you can go in there and find them. But remember, just because they've been done does not mean they're still active. A flood map could have changed, an elevation could have changed, and you may have had to revalidate or it didn't get revalidated. So that might be why you've been placed back in there. In fact, we saw this happen in Augusta, Georgia, where a gentleman went from $700 a year of flood insurance to $7,000 because his base flood elevation changed by 7 feet.
Wow, okay, so we're almost finished here. Our next question is, do I need separate flood insurance for my detached garage that's part of my business loan?
Especially in a business loan, you're looking at these as, detached. Think about detached, they're not together. So typically, as long as they don't have a shared roof or something like that, you're going to want separate policies with the National Flood Insurance Program. Now, some private companies may provide coverage for these as other structures. They may have limitations here. Some of them only cover 10%, up to 25%. So depending on the value here, you may need separate policies, or you could do what's called a blanket commercial policy with a private flood insurance company. But remember, typically, the National Flood Insurance Program does not offer these in 2025.
Okay, so the next one is there any scenario where getting a elevation certificate will hurt my flood insurance rates?
Typically, it's not going to hurt because remember, FEMA's using their own elevation numbers now. And now, if they do have an elevation certificate that improves it, remember, even if you're 6 months into the policy, you can go back to the beginning and they will prorate that rate for you back from the beginning. So even if you're 8 months in, it could still be an advantage for you to do that. Now, you're probably ask, what's the average cost of one of these? And it really depends on the area, but across the country, on average, we see these costing about $1,000 to get an elevation certificate done. And you don't have to get one done every year, but you may have to get them done from time to time if your base flood elevation's changed or your flood map's changed.
Okay, so our final question here says, my old commercial building is worth way more than its replacement cost. How does that affect my flood insurance?
Remember, the one thing that's going to impact your flood insurance cost is going to be replacement. So you can't really get more coverage than your replacement cost here.
Okay.
The cost to rebuild, you can go ahead and put it on a policy if you want, but a underwriter is never going to actually give you that during a claim. So be careful about that. So if you've got a building with a $300,000 replacement cost, but you're trying to put $600,000 on it, you're never going to get that. But unfortunately, most insurance agents just don't tell the client that because they're just not aware of that sometimes. So you want to make sure you understand that going in, that you're really only going to get the most is what the actual replacement cost is. And don't just try to throw a replacement cost on there that's not real, because the National Flood Insurance Program is going to make you provide a document showing what the actual replacement cost is. Also remember, if you're overestimating that replacement cost in commercial, it can have a big impact on your wallet with a policy through the National Flood Insurance Program or many private flood insurance companies.
Okay, well that's all I have for today, Chris.
Well, folks, I want to say thank you for for watching today's video. What are SFHA's special flood hazard areas? I hope you've enjoyed the video. Remember, share, subscribe, like the channel below. If you're ready to take the next steps to protecting your residential or your commercial property, or simply finding out if you're in one of these areas, click in the description below. I'm Chris with the Flood Insurance Guru, and he's Jacob, and we look forward to seeing you next time.